you see the American political system heading for a civil war? And second of all, do you see the breadlines of the Great Depression rearing its head again in the contemporary stage in which we're living in today?
Speaking of the industrial countries,
right.
Because of course in the third world it's all over. Yeah. Well, with regard to the breadline, first of all, the U.S. has, the last I saw, there are about 30 million people, according to the studies that have been done, about 30 million people are suffering hunger in the United States. Take, say, Boston, where I live, which is a very rich city, and in fact, maybe the world's leading medical center. There are very fancy hospitals, but there's also a hospital that works for, that's the city hospital. So like everybody goes to. That hospital, which is not a bad hospital, I should say, a couple of years ago, they established a malnutrition clinic because they were beginning, after the impact of Reaganism was felt, they were beginning to find in Boston third world levels of malnutrition. And in fact, got worse over the winter because families had to make a choice. Do you let your kids starve or you let them die of the cold? Okay, that's, one of the richest cities in the world, major medical center. I mean, bread lines are, if we don't have bread lines, we have the equivalent. Over 30 million people is a lot of people, and that's plenty of children and so on. And it's going to grow. What about, it's not starvation like, say, Haiti or, Nicaragua or Cuba or something, but it's probably worse than Cuba in many places, but it's real, And it has long-term effects. I mean, when kids are suffering malnutrition, that has a permanent effect, has an effect on their lives, they'll never get over it. And that's just criminal in a country as rich as this, or anywhere for that matter. As to the Civil War, I think it's very much up in the air what's going to happen in the United States. There's an experiment going on. The experiment is, can you marginalize a large part of the population, regard them as superfluous, because they're not helping make those dazzling profits, and can you set up a world in which production is carried out by the most oppressed people with the fewest rights in the most flexible labor markets, and production is for the rich people of the world. So this can be done internationally now. It's not like the old days when economies are more or less national. So can you get, can you get women in China to work in factories where they're locked in and they die in factory fires, because as is happening incidentally? Can you get them to produce the toys that are sold in stores in New York and Baltimore, where rich people buy them to give them to their children for Christmas? I mean, that's sort of, to give an example, that's a real example, incidentally. Can you have an economy where everything works like that? So production by the most impoverished and exploited for the richest and most privileged internationally. And with large parts of the general population just marginalized because they don't contribute to the system. In, say, Colombia, murdered. In New York, locked up in prison. Can you do that? Nobody knows the answer to that question. Could it lead to a civil war? It definitely could. It could lead to uprisings, revolts. There are other things to worry about. The United States happens to be an extremely fundamentalist country. It's kind of like Iran, sort of, if you look at it. It's a religious fundamentalist country that's, again, off the spectrum in this regard. It's not like other industrial countries. None come close. And that's a very dangerous phenomenon, in my opinion. It means that there's deep irrationality, which can be whipped up by demagogues, the Newt Gingriches. These guys can whip up hatred, fear, they can appeal to religious fundamentalist urges and so on, and that's scary, scaring most of the world, I should say. If you recall the last Republican National Convention, it opened with a God and Country rally, which was televised. That was seen around the world. And in Europe, particularly, it really sent chills up people's spines. I mean, they remember Hitler's Nuremberg rallies, at least older people do. And it had something of that tone. And it's kind of striking, and natural that the Republican, I don't mean to say the two parties are all that different. I gave some examples to illustrate the opposite. But there's some difference between them. The Republicans are openly and outspokenly the party of business. They don't make much of a pretense to be anything else. And that means that the only way they can rally the public is behind jingoism, fear, hatred, slander, other techniques which have been used quite effectively to organize great masses of people in times of real distress. We don't have to go back very far in history to find that. Germany in the 1930s was, maybe the most civilized and advanced country in the world. All right, it was possible, but plenty of problems. And it was possible to whip up hatred, fear, and to mobilize people, and in fact to carry out certain, what from their point of view was social development even, and with consequences that you're familiar with. Yeah, that could, why are we different? We've got the same genes. And the conditions in the culture that might be part of the background for that, they exist. On the other hand, there are other things. There's a streak of independence and opposition to authority in the United States, which is maybe also unique in the world. That's a very healthy thing. Can show up in antisocial ways, like running around with assault rifles, but it could also show up in healthy ways. And the trick is to make it show up in healthy ways, like opposition to illegitimate authority, which it could do. This is maybe the country in the world that most protects freedom of speech. I happen to think that's a very good thing. I know a lot of people don't agree, but I think it is. And that was won by centuries of struggle. I mean, freedom of speech was achieved in the United States, really, through the Civil Rights Movement, which finally got the Supreme Court to knock down the centuries-old laws against criticism of state power. That came right through the Civil Rights Movement. Well, those are gains that are real and that offer a basis for doing things. So, it's complicated. Yeah, could it be a civil war? It could be very unpleasant. A lot of very ugly things could happen. They're not inconceivable, but they're also not inevitable.